Respect isn't lost the moment someone insults you. It's lost the moment the room decides they're right. I didn't understand how true those words were until the night my wife smiled at a ballroom full of executives and introduced me as, "This is Daniel. Just my husband." The laughter wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It came in polite little bursts, hidden behind crystal glasses and practiced corporate smiles. A few people nodded at me the way you acknowledge someone's chauffeur or a distant cousin at a wedding. One vice president shook my hand without asking my name. Another immediately turned back to Olivia before I could finish saying hello. I simply smiled, adjusted the cuff of my charcoal suit, and took a slow sip of bourbon. 5 minutes. That was all it would take for every single person in that ballroom to stand when I entered the stage. My name is Daniel Brooks. I'm 47 years old, and for the last 18 years, I've been married to Olivia Brooks, one of the fastest rising senior executives at Ashford Technologies. If you had asked anyone at that gala who carried our family, they would have answered without hesitation. Olivia. She gave keynote presentations, closed multi-million-dollar contracts, appeared in business magazines, and flew first class, so often she knew flight attendants by name. Me? According to the story she slowly built over the years, I was the quiet husband who enjoyed retirement a little too early. The man who cooked dinner, took care of the house, volunteered on weekends, and somehow always had time to pick her up from the airport. She never exactly lied. She simply stopped telling the whole truth. At first, I didn't mind. Success changes people in subtle ways, like sunlight fading old photographs one afternoon at a time. She stopped introducing me as the entrepreneur she once admired. Then I became the guy who used to work in software. Eventually, I became just Daniel. Finally, somewhere along the way, I became just her husband. Funny how a single word can erase decades. The gala was being held at the Grand Lexington Hotel in downtown Chicago, where chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls above polished marble floors. Every table sparkled beneath soft golden light. Waiters floated across the ballroom carrying silver trays filled with steak medallions, lobster tails, and champagne that probably cost more than my first car. Everywhere I looked, people wore confidence as comfortably as their tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. Olivia fit perfectly into that world. Emerald dress, diamond earrings, hair pinned flawlessly. She laughed with board members as though she'd been born into the room. I watched her from a respectful distance because that's what I'd always done. I never wanted to compete with her success. I wanted to protect it. Maybe that was my first mistake. Then the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and gently tapped the microphone. The conversation softened. Glasses settled onto linen-covered tables. Somewhere across the ballroom, I noticed 3 members of the board quietly entering through a side door much earlier than expected. One of them glanced toward me. Our eyes met for only a second before he gave the smallest nod imaginable. I looked down at my watch. 4 minutes left. I slipped my watch back beneath my shirt cuff and let the room continue pretending nothing unusual was about to happen. 4 minutes could feel like forever when you had spent 15 years learning how to disappear. I picked up a sparkling water from a passing waiter instead of another bourbon. I wanted my head clear. I had learned a long time ago that important moments deserved steady hands, not dramatic reactions. Across the ballroom, Olivia was laughing with Richard Lawson, the company's chief executive officer. Richard was the kind of executive who always stood perfectly straight, even when he was relaxed. His tuxedo fit like it had been tailored inside the hotel. Every few seconds, another manager joined their circle, eager for a few seconds of conversation that might someday become a promotion. I watched Olivia carefully. She looked confident, polished, completely at home. Seeing her that happy should have made me smile. Instead, it reminded me of another evening almost 2 decades earlier, when she was the one standing nervously beside me at a much smaller banquet. Then she had just graduated with her Master of Business Administration. We could not afford expensive dinners, so we celebrated with burgers from a neighborhood diner outside Milwaukee. She held my hand across the table and said, "One day, I am going to make you proud." I laughed because I already was. She believed in me before anyone else did. She believed in every impossible dream I chased while building software out of a rented warehouse with secondhand computers and folding tables. Those were exhausting years. Coffee replaced sleep. Every dollar went back into the company. There were months when I wore the same two dress shirts to every investor meeting because buying new clothes meant delaying payroll for someone who needed it more than I did. Olivia never complained. She packed sandwiches for me before sunrise and waited up until midnight just to ask how my day had gone. Success belonged to both of us then. Somewhere between promotions, stock options, business magazines, and executive retreats, our story quietly changed. Not all at once. Never dramatically. It happened one introduction at a time. She stopped saying, "This is my husband. He built a software company." Instead it became, "Daniel used to work in technology." Deliberate. Almost ceremonial. I noticed Margaret Ellis, chairwoman of the board, smoothing the front of her navy evening gown before walking toward the stage with a slim black folder in her hands. The master of ceremonies leaned closer as she whispered something into his ear. His eyebrows lifted in surprise before he nodded immediately. The orchestra stopped playing in the middle of a song. A silence settled over the ballroom that felt heavier than any speech. I looked at my watch once more. 1 minute remained. Margaret Ellis stepped onto the stage with the calm confidence of someone who never needed to raise her voice to command attention. Conversations dissolved almost instantly. Even the waitstaff paused along the walls, sensing that the evening had drifted away from its carefully printed schedule. The master of ceremonies smiled politely, but I could tell from the uncertainty in his eyes that whatever was about to happen had not been included in his script. Margaret accepted the microphone without looking at the audience right away. Instead, she opened the slim black folder, glanced at a single page, then closed it again as though she had already memorized every word. "Good evening," she began. "Before we continue with tonight's awards, the board of directors has one additional presentation that we unanimously agreed could not wait until our annual shareholders meeting." A ripple of curiosity spread across the ballroom. Richard Lawson straightened his posture beside Olivia. Several department heads exchanged puzzled looks. Olivia folded her hands in front of her, probably assuming another executive was about to receive a leadership award. She even leaned toward Richard and whispered something that made him smile politely, although his attention never left Margaret. I remained exactly where I was near the back of the ballroom, my hands resting loosely around the glass of sparkling water that had long since lost its bubbles. The silence reminded me of investor meetings years ago, those strange moments just before someone decided whether to believe in your future or walk away forever. Margaret continued, "Every successful company has public faces. The people who give interviews, lead conferences, and stand in front of cameras. But sometimes the individual most responsible for protecting an organization chooses to remain unseen." More whispers floated through the room. I noticed Thomas Reed, the chief operating officer, quietly nodding to himself as though he already knew where the speech was headed. Richard glanced toward the board table with growing concern. Olivia finally looked uncomfortable. She scanned the room, searching for clues that everyone else seemed to be missing. Margaret smiled warmly. "For nearly 2 decades, one person has quietly protected this company through economic downturns, market crashes, acquisition attempts, and more than one financial crisis. Without his decisions, Ashford Technologies would not exist in its current form." My heartbeat remained steady, but I could feel hundreds of people leaning emotionally toward the stage, waiting for a name. The orchestra remained silent. Even the air conditioning seemed quieter. Margaret looked directly across the ballroom. Not toward the executive tables. Not toward Richard. Not toward Olivia. Toward me. "Daniel Brooks," she said clearly. "Would you please join me on stage?" For one long second, nothing happened. Then chairs began sliding backward across polished marble. Margaret stood first. Thomas Reed rose beside her. Richard Lawson followed immediately. One after another, every member of the board of directors stood to their feet. The executives nearest the stage looked around in confusion before standing as well. Within moments, the movement spread across the ballroom like a silent wave rolling across the ocean. Hundreds of guests rose together. The applause started softly, almost uncertain, then grew louder until it filled every corner of the Grand Lexington Hotel. I looked toward Olivia. The smile she had worn all evening disappeared completely. Her eyes searched my face as if she had suddenly realized she was looking at a man she had never fully known. I placed my glass on the nearest table, adjusted the front of my jacket, and began walking toward the stage. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The same people who had barely noticed. Me 5 minutes earlier stepped aside to clear a path through the center of the ballroom. And for the first time that evening, every single pair of eyes followed me. The applause did not fade as I climbed the 3 carpeted steps to the stage. It followed me like an echo from a life I had deliberately left behind years earlier. Margaret greeted me with a warm smile and extended her hand, but instead of shaking it immediately, I quietly thanked her for keeping the surprise until the last possible moment. She smiled and whispered, "You earned this long ago." Then she stepped aside and invited me to stand beside her beneath the bright lights. Looking out across the ballroom, I saw expressions I had become familiar with over the years. Confusion, curiosity, disbelief. Olivia stood perfectly still near the front of the room, her hands resting at her sides, her eyes fixed on me as though every memory we had ever shared was suddenly being rewritten. Margaret turned back to the audience. "Many of you know the company that exists today," she said. "Very few of you know the company that almost disappeared 19 years ago." A large screen behind us came to life. The elegant company logo faded into an old photograph of a narrow brick warehouse on the edge of Milwaukee. Its paint was peeling. The parking lot was cracked. 3 aging pickup trucks sat outside beneath a faded sign that barely remained attached to the building. Quiet murmurs spread across the ballroom. Another photograph appeared. 6 young software engineers stood around folding tables covered with desktop computers, tangled cables, empty pizza boxes, and whiteboards packed with handwritten code. Then another image. A younger version of me wearing jeans, safety glasses, and a faded blue sweatshirt while carrying computer servers through the warehouse by hand. There were no luxury offices, no glass conference rooms, no polished headquarters overlooking downtown Chicago. There was only hope held together by determination and very little sleep. Margaret continued speaking. When Ashford Technologies was weeks away from bankruptcy, banks refused additional financing. Investors had already walked away. Payroll was in danger. The company was preparing to close its doors permanently. Richard lowered his eyes. He had known the story in broad strokes, but not every detail. The screen changed again, revealing scanned documents from nearly 2 decades earlier. Purchase agreements, merger contracts, emergency financing. Every signature at the bottom belonged to one person. Mine. Daniel Brooks sold his successful software company, Margaret explained. He invested nearly everything he had into saving Ashford Technologies. Instead of taking control publicly, he created a long-term ownership trust designed to protect the company without placing himself at the center of attention. A surprised gasp traveled through the audience. Olivia's lips parted slightly. I could almost see the pieces falling together inside her mind. The nights I worked quietly in my home office. The confidential phone calls I occasionally stepped outside to answer. The quarterly reports delivered by overnight courier. The board meetings I attended under the explanation of consulting work. None of it had been random. I had simply never corrected the version of my life that became more convenient for everyone else to believe. Margaret opened the black folder one final time. Today, Daniel Brooks remains the majority shareholder of Ashford Technologies and has served as the silent guardian of this company through every major decision for the last 19 years. The room fell completely silent, not because people doubted her words anymore, but because they were suddenly measuring every conversation they had ever had with me against the truth they had just learned. I looked across the ballroom one more time before stepping toward the microphone, and the only sound left in the room was the quiet breathing of hundreds of people waiting to hear what the man they had overlooked was finally going to say. I rested both hands lightly on the podium and waited. Not because I had forgotten what I wanted to say, but because silence has a way of making people listen harder than words ever could. The applause faded naturally until the ballroom became so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the chandeliers overhead. I looked around the room, meeting familiar faces one at a time. Engineers, managers, receptionists, custodians, young interns standing near the back. Some had worked here for 20 years. Others had started only weeks ago. They all deserved the same thing. Respect. "Thank you," I said softly. "Not for standing, for staying." A few puzzled smiles appeared across the audience. 19 years ago, this company was fighting to survive. We did not have impressive offices or glamorous galas. We had folding chairs, borrowed computers, and people who believed tomorrow could be better than today. I glanced at the photographs still displayed behind me. The technology mattered. The contracts mattered. But none of those things saved this company. People did. Heads nodded throughout the ballroom. I have spent most of my career avoiding stages like this one. That was never because I disliked recognition. It was because I wanted the work to matter more than the person doing it. I paused and looked toward the executives seated near the front. Titles are useful. They create structure. They define responsibility. But titles should never determine how much dignity another human being deserves. The room remained perfectly still. Nobody reached for a phone. Nobody whispered. Every person who walks through these doors carries a story you cannot see. The assistant answering calls. The maintenance technician replacing ceiling lights. The quiet spouse standing beside an executive at a company event. You never know who helped build the road you are walking on today. I noticed Richard lower his head slightly. Thomas Reed folded his hands together. Margaret simply watched with quiet satisfaction. Then my eyes found Olivia. She had not moved since I stepped onto the stage. The confidence that had filled her expression earlier that evening had been replaced by something far more honest. Reflection. I did not mention her name. I did not need to. Years ago, I made a promise to myself. I continued. If I was fortunate enough to build something meaningful, I would never ask people to admire me. I would ask them to care for one another. Companies rise because talented people work together. Companies last because decent people choose to respect each other even when nobody is watching. The applause that followed began slowly but felt different this time. It was warmer, more personal. When it settled again, I smiled. Before tonight continues, there is one announcement I would like to make. I turned toward Margaret, who handed me another folder. Beginning next quarter, Ashford Technologies will launch the Brooks Leadership Fellowship. Every year, employees from every department, regardless of position, will be eligible for full tuition assistance, leadership mentoring, and professional development funded by my family's ownership trust. Audible surprise spread across the ballroom. Some employees exchanged emotional glances. Others immediately began clapping again. I continued before the applause fully built. Potential has never belonged only to corner offices. Sometimes the next great leader is sitting at the front desk greeting visitors with a smile. Sometimes they are repairing servers after midnight. Sometimes they are quietly doing the right thing while nobody notices. As the applause grew stronger once more, I stepped back from the microphone. Across the ballroom, Olivia slowly lowered her eyes. For the first time since we arrived that evening, I saw her not as a successful executive or as my wife, but as someone finally beginning to understand the weight of the words she had spoken only minutes before. The applause lingered long after I stepped away from the podium. People were no longer clapping because the board expected them to. They were clapping because something inside the room had shifted. I could see it in the faces of employees who had spent years believing they were invisible. A maintenance supervisor wiped his eyes before quickly pretending he had something in them. A young software engineer smiled at the receptionist beside her as though they suddenly belonged to the same story. That mattered more to me than every headline the company had ever earned. Margaret leaned toward the microphone once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said with a warm smile, "there is one final matter before we continue tonight's celebration." She looked toward me. "Daniel, if you would remain here for another moment." I nodded and stepped back beside her. Richard Lawson walked onto the stage carrying a polished wooden presentation box. His expression was calm, but I could see the humility behind it. He stopped in front of me and extended his hand. This time I accepted it immediately. "I owe you more than thanks," he said clearly enough for the microphone to catch every word. 19 years ago, you saved this company. Tonight, you reminded all of us why it deserved to be saved. The ballroom answered with another round of applause. Richard opened the presentation box. Inside rested a simple silver lapel pin shaped like the original Ashford Technologies logo from nearly 2 decades earlier. Most employees had probably never seen it before. This was the first company emblem, Richard explained. Only 6 were ever made. We believed the last one had been lost. He carefully attached it to my jacket. Tonight it finally returns to the person who should have been wearing it all along. For a brief moment, I could not find the right words. Not because I was overwhelmed by recognition, but because I remembered the tiny warehouse where that logo had first been sketched on the corner of a legal pad with an ordinary blue pen. Back then it represented hope more than success. Looking at it now, I realized hope had lasted much longer than I ever imagined. Margaret smiled again before making the final announcement. Effective immediately, The board has unanimously approved the establishment of the Daniel Brooks Innovation Center, where future employees will receive leadership training, mentorship, and entrepreneurship education inspired by the values that built this company. The audience stood once again without being asked. The standing ovation felt different from the first one. Earlier they had stood because of who I was. Now they stood because of what the company could become. As the applause slowly settled, employees began approaching the stage one after another. A young accountant thanked me for creating the new fellowship program. A facilities manager shook my hand and quietly said he had worked there for 23 years and had never before felt that someone from the ownership truly saw people like him. A customer service representative introduced herself and admitted she had almost resigned the previous month because she believed her work did not matter. I told her it mattered more than she realized. Every conversation lasted less than a minute, yet each one reminded me why I had stayed behind the curtain for so many years. Then, through the growing crowd, I noticed Olivia standing alone exactly where I had last seen her. She had not joined the line of employees waiting to speak with me. She simply watched from a distance, her expression no longer filled with confusion but with quiet regret. For the first time in many years, there was no executive confidence in her posture, no carefully practiced smile, no polished presentation. There was only a woman slowly recognizing that the greatest distance between two people is not measured in miles or years. It is measured by everything left unsaid. Most people assumed the evening would slowly return to normal after the ceremony ended. They were wrong. Moments like that do not simply disappear beneath them. Admitted with an embarrassed laugh that he had assumed I was simply a retired consultant married to an executive. I smiled gently. That is an easy assumption to make when nobody tells you otherwise. He looked relieved that I had not taken offense, but his expression quickly turned thoughtful. I suppose I should start asking more questions before making conclusions, he said. We all should, I replied. Across the ballroom, I noticed Olivia speaking quietly with Margaret Ellis. Their conversation appeared calm, but Olivia's posture had changed completely. Earlier, she had stood with the confidence of someone accustomed to being admired. Now her shoulders were lower, her movements slower, as though the weight she carried was no longer ambition but reflection. Margaret rested a reassuring hand on her arm before walking away, leaving Olivia standing alone beside one of the tall marble columns. For several minutes, she remained there without speaking to anyone. People approached her politely, offering congratulations on the recognition I had received, but every response she gave seemed quieter than the one before it. She was no longer performing the role of the successful executive. She was simply trying to understand how two versions of the same man had existed in her life without ever truly meeting each other. I found myself remembering another evening many years earlier when we had celebrated my first successful acquisition with takeout pizza because neither of us wanted to spend money on a fancy restaurant. Olivia had looked at me across our tiny apartment kitchen and said, "Promise me something. If we ever become successful, we will never become impressed with ourselves." At the time, I believed promises like that lasted forever. Perhaps they do. Sometimes they simply become buried beneath promotions, schedules, and applause until life forces you to dig them back up again. A young intern approached me carrying a small notebook. He apologized for interrupting and asked if I would sign the inside cover. I laughed softly. "I think you are giving me far too much credit." He shook his head. "No, sir. Tonight you reminded me that leadership does not have to be loud." His words stayed with me long after he walked away. They reminded me why I had accepted Margaret's invitation to attend the gala in the first place. Not to reveal who I was. To remind people what matters before titles, before wealth, and before recognition. As I slipped the pen back into my jacket pocket, I looked across the ballroom once more. Olivia had finally lifted her eyes toward me. This time she did not look confused. She looked as though she wanted to say something she should have said years ago. She took one careful step in my direction, then another, while the conversations around us quietly faded into the background. Olivia stopped a few feet away from me, close enough that I could see the faint shimmer in her eyes beneath the ballroom lights. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Around us, conversations continued, glasses clinked softly, and the orchestra drifted through another familiar melody, yet everything beyond those few feet seemed strangely distant. She drew in a careful breath. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I do not even know where to begin." I gave her a small, Patient smile. The beginning usually works. She looked down at the marble floor before meeting my eyes again. When I introduced you tonight, I heard the words come out of my mouth, but I never stopped to think about what they sounded like. I thought it was harmless. I thought everyone already knew who you were. I did not interrupt. She continued. The truth is, I stopped telling your story because somewhere along the way I convinced myself my career was the interesting one. I kept making you smaller so I could fit into rooms where everyone was trying to prove they mattered. Her voice trembled slightly before she steadied it again. I never realized I was doing that until tonight. I nodded slowly. I know. She looked surprised. You knew? Not all at once, I answered. Little moments. Little introductions. Small jokes. They seemed insignificant by themselves. But small things repeated over many years become something much larger. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. Why did you never tell me? That question had lived quietly between us for longer than either of us wanted to admit. I looked across the ballroom toward the giant screen that was now displaying photographs from the company's newest community projects. Because I wanted you to love the life we built together, not the titles attached to it. And because every time I thought about correcting you, I hoped you would remember on your own. Her shoulders lowered. Instead, I forgot. There was no anger in her voice now. Only honesty. Yes, I replied softly. You forgot. The silence between us no longer felt heavy. It felt truthful. Olivia glanced toward the stage where employees were still gathering around the fellowship display Margaret had announced earlier. When everyone stood tonight, she whispered, I realized something that frightened me. I waited. I was not shocked that they respected you. I was shocked that I had slowly stopped seeing you the way they did. Those words landed deeper than any apology could have. Not because they excused the past, but because they named it honestly. I reached for a glass of water from a nearby table and handed it to her. She accepted it with a quiet thank you. Daniel, she asked carefully, have I damaged something that cannot be repaired? I looked at the skyline beyond the ballroom windows. Thousands of lights stretched across Chicago, each one shining quietly without asking anyone to notice. Respect grows slowly, I said. It can also fade slowly. The good news is that anything built one day at a time can also be rebuilt one day at a time, if both people are willing to do the work. She held the glass with both hands, absorbing every word. There were no dramatic promises, no grand declarations. Only two people finally having the conversation they should have had years earlier. As we stood together in comfortable silence, Margaret approached with a warm smile. Daniel, she said, the board would like to invite both of you to join us for a private breakfast tomorrow morning. We would like to discuss the future of the fellowship and several ideas for strengthening the culture across the company. Before I could answer, Margaret looked at Olivia with gentle kindness. Enters a boardroom. Sometimes it begins with the courage to see another person clearly. Olivia lowered her eyes once more, but this time she was not hiding from the truth. She was learning how to carry it.